Question 2, what's the difference between Scotch and whiskey? Okay, so this is kind of along the same lines of the question about what's the difference between whiskey and bourbon. So whiskey, remember, is going to be a grain-based spirit. It's going to be distilled beer, essentially. In order for something to be labeled bourbon, it has to be made in America. So all Scotch is whiskey that's made in Scotland. Second difference is that most Scotch whiskey, the grain is going to be malted barley, the prominent grain, but whereas in America, most whiskey is based on corn. Corn will be the prominent grain. So probably the difference between whiskey and Scotch is that usually, whiskey, American whiskey is going to be grain-based, predominantly corn, and Scotch is going to be whiskey that's made in Scotland and, primarily malted barley. So probably the main difference again is that whiskey can be made anywhere. Scotch whiskey is made in Scotland. Bourbon is made in America, but all of them are whiskeys, grain-based, kind of like a tree. Is Jack Daniel's a whiskey or bourbon? Yes. I know, that's like a funny answer. So I can tell you this, that technically Jack Daniel's meets all the criteria of being a bourbon. What happened is they kind of took it as like a marketing thing to differentiate themselves from the pack, but Jack Daniel's technically is a bourbon. There's nothing particular about Jack Daniel's that doesn't make it a bourbon. What makes Jack Daniel's and Tennessee whiskeys distinctive is that before the raw spirit is put in the barrel, it gets filtered through maple, I believe. That's the only difference. Before it gets put in the barrel, they filter it through charcoal, maple, then it ages. But there's nothing in the rules for bourbon that says you can't do that. So that's why technically Jack Daniel's is a bourbon, but for marketing reasons, they decided to separate themselves from the pack. But very good question. A lot of people ask that question. Next question, is Crown Royal a bourbon or a whiskey? So Crown Royal is definitely not a bourbon because it's made in Canada. One of the rules for bourbon is that it has to be made in the United States of America. So immediately we know that Crown Royal is not a bourbon. It is a whiskey. It's a Canadian whiskey. Usually the way they do whiskey in Canada is they blend a lot of different whiskeys together to come up with like a certain flavor profile that they're trying to hit. Whereas traditional straight bourbon whiskey, America is not blended usually. So good question.